The storm had been raging for hours, but the worst was yet to come. Inside the small apartment, Sarah sat quietly, lost in the shadows of her thoughts. Her vision had become blurry once again, a sensation she had grown all too familiar with over the years. Sarah was no stranger to the challenges her illness presented, but this time something felt different. Something was wrong. Then a faint sound broke through the silence, the soft click of paws on the floor. Max, her guide dog, had not left her side in over a decade. Retired now, he had become more than just her eyes. He was her constant, her companion, and her protector. But tonight, Max would have to be something more. As Sarah's condition worsened and the world around her began to fade, Max made a decision that would defy everything he had been trained to do. He could not wait for help. In a world where every second counted, Max was running out of time. Would he be able to save Sarah before it was too late? The apartment was a quiet, dimly lit place, filled with the soft hum of an old fan in the corner. The walls were lined with framed photos of Sarah's life, each picture a memory frozen in time. Her favorite painting, a vibrant landscape of a place she had once dreamed of visiting, hung across from the couch where she sat now. The silence was overwhelming. It had been that way for months. Sarah glanced over at Max, curled up on the rug beside her. Max had been her guide dog for over 12 years. He had helped her navigate the world, giving her the independence she needed. But the illness that had begun years ago, one that slowly stole her sight, had now begun to take more from her than she could bear. Max was no longer the energetic, alert dog he used to be. He was now retired, lounging in the comfort of their home as they both aged, their lives intertwined. Despite the quiet, comforting presence Max provided, Sarah could not help but feel a deep sadness. She had always known that Max's time with her would not last forever, but she had hoped they would grow old together. Now, there were moments when he seemed distant, distracted or lost in his own world, as though he no longer understood her. It was late afternoon when Sarah realized that something was wrong. Max had always been attentive, instinctively aware of her needs, whether it was when she needed to cross the street or when she simply needed to rest. But that afternoon, Max did not respond when Sarah called his name. She tried again, this time raising her voice, but his ears remained unresponsive and he simply lay still. A wave of panic washed over her. She gently reached out and touched Max's soft fur, trying to pull him from his stupor. But when she lifted his head slightly to meet his gaze, his eyes were unfocused, distant. It was as if he didn't recognize her, and in that moment, a deep ache settled in her chest. Max had always been more than just a dog. He had been her eyes when she could not see, guiding her through the world with unshakable loyalty. But now it seemed as if that bond was slipping through her fingers, like sand drifting away in the wind. Max's age had caught up with him. His joints were stiffer, and his movement slower. At times, Sarah wondered if he had grown tired of the role he had played for so long, perhaps even forgotten the depth of their connection. But today, there was something different in his gaze. He seemed lost. The dog that had once led her with confidence through busy streets, bustling malls, and crowded parks was now just a shadow of the vibrant animal she had known. Sarah stood up and walked carefully across the room, counting the steps, trying to ignore the rising panic in her chest. She grabbed a cane, though she had not used it in years, and tapped the ground lightly to ensure she was steady. She turned back to Max, who was still lying there, eyes closed now as if resting. But it was not sleep. It was something deeper, something more troubling. Max's confusion was not just emotional, it felt physical too, as though his mind could no longer connect with his body the way it used to. This was not the dog who had once guided her through the chaos of life. The realization hit her hard. Was Max really fading away? Had he become so lost in his own world that he could no longer recognize her? It was a terrifying thought. But she also understood that Max had been her rock through so many difficult moments. He had been there when she lost her sight, when she struggled with the emotional weight of her condition. And now, even though he seemed distant, she still needed him more than ever. It was then that she remembered the small touches, the way he used to nudge her when she needed to move, or the way he would rest his head on her lap when she felt down. Those moments spoke louder than words. Despite his confusion, the bond was still there, buried deep beneath the surface. And Sarah realized that this emotional reconnection was the key. She could not give up on Max. He had given so much to her already, and now it was her turn to help him find his way back. Max had always been more than just a dog, he was family, and no matter how distant he had become, Sarah knew she could not lose him. Not now, not when the world felt so empty without him by her side. The real challenge was not just for Max to remember who he was or what he had done, but for Sarah to remember that, despite everything, they still had a chance. A chance to reconnect, a chance to find each other again, and a chance for Max to lead her through one final chapter of their lives together. But as Sarah sat on the couch staring at her aging guide dog, she could not shake the fear that perhaps their time together was truly running out. Max had always been there for Sarah. His deep, soulful eyes were the ones that first met hers after every surgery, after every failed treatment, after every painful day. Together, they had faced her gradual loss of sight, learning how to navigate the world side by side. Their bond had been forged in those early years of struggle and perseverance, an unspoken understanding between them that transcended words. Now, as Sarah sat motionless on the couch, a deep sense of isolation washed over her. Max had always been her eyes, her guide, but this afternoon she felt more alone than ever. It wasn't just that Max wasn't responding, it was the distance between them, a quiet rift that seemed to have grown in the space where their connection once thrived. She reached out, her fingers brushing the top of his head, but Max barely flinched, as though the touch meant nothing to him anymore. Sarah tried not to let the frustration build, but it was hard. She had always been independent, relying on Max to guide her through the world. Yet now, the once vibrant dog seemed almost a shadow of his former self. When she gently called his name, hoping for even a flicker of recognition, Max remained unmoving, his gaze distant, as though he had forgotten what it meant to be a guide dog, to be her guide dog. There was a moment of disbelief. How could this happen? After all they had been through together, after all the moments of love and support, how could he not recognize her? The pain of it stung more than Sarah had expected. Her hands trembled as she reached out again, but Max simply shifted, as if trying to escape her touch. It was in these quiet moments, the ones that stretched out endlessly, that the fear began to creep in. She had always known that aging would change their dynamic, but she never imagined that it would feel so sharp, so final. She needed Max to be there for her, not just as a companion, but as a lifeline. She needed him to recognize her, to return to the role he had played so effortlessly in the past. Max, however, seemed trapped in a fog of confusion. The sounds of the apartment, the familiar smells, the routine, they all seemed to mean nothing to him now. He wandered through the rooms aimlessly, as if unsure of his place in this world that once made perfect sense to him. In moments of isolation like these, Sarah's thoughts often drifted back to the memories that had defined their bond. She remembered the first time they met, how nervous she had been, unsure if she could handle the responsibility of a guide dog. But Max had made it look so easy. From the very first day, he had led her confidently through the streets, guiding her through busy crosswalks and crowded shops. They were a team, and every step they took was a testament to their unbreakable connection. But now those memories felt distant, like a story from someone else's life. Sarah tried to hold on to them, but they slipped through her fingers like sand. As the days went by, the tension between them only grew. Sarah's doubts began to take root. She tried everything, whistling, calling his name, even tapping the floor with her cane. But Max showed little to no reaction. He still followed her around the house, still slept by her side, but it felt like he was no longer present in the way he used to be. She would catch glimpses of his old self, a flash of recognition in his eyes when he heard her voice, or a subtle tail wag when she offered him his favorite treat. But these moments were fleeting, and soon he would retreat back into the distance, leaving Sarah feeling more isolated than ever. One morning, Sarah went to the kitchen to prepare breakfast, her hand shaking slightly as she reached for the cereal box. Max followed her as he always had, but today he seemed distracted. As she opened the cabinet, Max nudged her with his nose and looked up at her with a soft whine. For a brief second, she felt a spark of hope, but then just as quickly Max turned away and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Sarah standing there with a bittersweet smile. It was the same routine as always, yet somehow everything felt different. The frustration built, a constant knot in Sarah's chest that refused to loosen. She tried to push it away, but the pain lingered, gnawing at her. Why wasn't he the dog he used to be? Had he forgotten everything they had been through? Did he no longer trust her, or worse, did he no longer love her? One afternoon, Sarah decided to take Max for a walk, hoping the change of scenery would trigger something in him. She grabbed his leash, her fingers shaking slightly as she clipped it onto his collar. Max followed her dutifully, but he seemed distant, as if his thoughts were elsewhere. As they walked down the familiar path through the park, Sarah noticed how Max avoided the trees where he had once eagerly sniffed the ground, or the benches where they had sat together, enjoying the quiet moments of their companionship. Max no longer seemed to recognize the places that had once meant so much to both of them. A deep sadness settled over Sarah as they continued down the path. She watched Max walk ahead of her, his movements slow and unsteady, as though he were trying to remember something he had forgotten. She called his name softly, her voice barely above a whisper, but Max didn't turn back. It was as though the world around them had shifted, and the space that had once been filled with connection and understanding had now become a vast, empty void. But then, something changed. As they reached the end of the path, Sarah stopped to rest on a bench. She sighed heavily, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on her. Max sat beside her, his head resting on her lap, and for a moment there was silence. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath, and then, as if on instinct, she reached out and gently scratched behind Max's ears, just the way she had done so many times before. For a brief moment, Max lifted his head, his ears perking up as he leaned into her touch. He let out a soft, contented sigh. The world around them seemed to pause as Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Had he remembered? Was this the moment when he would finally recognize her again? But then, just as quickly as it had come, the moment slipped away. Max pulled back, his expression blank once more, and returned to his quiet, distant state. The tears came then, unbidden and unrelenting. Sarah wiped them away quickly, not wanting to appear weak in front of her dog. But in that moment, she realized something. Even if Max could not fully return to who he once was, even if he couldn't remember everything they had shared, he was still there. And as long as he was there, Sarah would never give up on him. This was not the end of their journey. It was just a new chapter. And in the silence that followed, Sarah knew one thing for sure. Max had not forgotten her. Not entirely. Sarah sat on the edge of the couch, her hands shaking as she lightly stroked Max's fur. The quiet in the room felt oppressive. The house, once filled with the sounds of Max's excited paws and the comforting rustle of his movements, was now suffocating in its stillness. The dog lay unmoving, his eyes dull, distant. Every minute that passed felt like a weight pressing harder on Sarah's chest. She tried calling him again, her voice softer this time, almost pleading. "Max, come here, boy." She had said it so many times over the years, always with the expectation that he would come running, eager to help, to be by her side. But now, there was no response, just the steady rhythm of his breathing. She fought the rising panic in her chest. Was this it? Was this the beginning of the end for their bond? Then, as if by instinct, Sarah reached for the whistle she kept on the table beside her. It was a small, simple item, one she had used with Max for years during their daily walks. The emotional breakthrough was hard-earned, and there was no simple resolution. As Sarah sat with Max, tears streaming down her face, she knew that their journey wasn't over. There would be challenges ahead, more moments of doubt, more struggles to reclaim what had been lost. But in that moment, with Max's soft eyes locked onto hers and his tail wagging gently, Sarah knew they were not alone in their fight. Together, they would face whatever came next. The morning light crept softly into the apartment, casting gentle rays across the room. Sarah sat on the couch, Max resting beside her, his head resting on her lap. The bond between them, once strained and uncertain, had been reignited. though it felt different now. It was not a return to the old days, it was something new, something more fragile, but still profound. After the moment of recognition, Sarah had spent the following days carefully rebuilding their connection. The initial relief had been overwhelming, and with it came a rush of joy. Max had remembered her. But beneath that joy, there was a deep current of uncertainty. Would things return to the way they were? Could Max, in his older age, continue to be the guide she had relied on for so long? Or had the dog she had known been lost to time and illness, never to be fully regained? Max seemed more content now. There was no longer that haunting distance in his eyes, no longer that look of confusion when Sarah called his name. But sometimes when she looked at him, she saw a dog not quite the same as the one who had once guided her through crowded streets and busy intersections. He was slower now, more deliberate in his movements, and sometimes it felt as though he was quietly waiting for her to guide him, as much as she had once relied on him. Still, Sarah understood. She had changed too. The journey she had walked with Max had altered her in ways she hadn't fully realized. The realization that she could not continue to rely on him for everything had been a hard pill to swallow, but it had also opened her eyes to something new. The strength she had gained in her independence. She no longer feared the world outside her home, and she no longer relied solely on Max for guidance. Max had his own path too. He had always been more than a guide dog. He had been her companion, her protector, her friend. But in the days that followed their reconnection, Sarah realized that Max too was learning to adapt. He no longer needed to be the energetic, perfect guide of his younger days. Instead, he had become something even more special. A quiet presence that understood her need for peace, for stability, and for love. He was no longer just a dog who guided her. He was a companion who walked alongside her. And that was enough. The days passed slowly, each one a small victory. Sarah found herself taking longer walks with Max, though she no longer relied on him to navigate every obstacle. He trotted beside her with his tail wagging, proud to be at her side as they explored the familiar paths of the neighborhood. She had learned to trust herself, to lean on her own abilities, but she also learned to appreciate the comfort of having Max beside her. In the evenings, they would sit together on the couch, the world outside fading away. Max would rest his head in her lap, and Sarah would gently run her fingers through his fur, feeling the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. It wasn't perfect, but it was their new normal. A quiet peace had settled between them. There was still much to learn, much to understand. Neither Sarah nor Max had fully healed from the years of struggle, of loss, of emotional disconnection. But they had both found something precious in their renewed bond, a sense of understanding, a recognition of each other's quiet needs. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was theirs to walk, side by side. As Sarah glanced down at Max, she knew that their journey wasn't finished, it had only just begun. If you believe in the incredible bond between humans and their dogs, and the power of second chances, then this story is for you. Max's journey of rediscovery with Sarah shows us that love and loyalty don't fade with time. They evolve. Every connection, every bond we share, is an ongoing story, full of twists, turns, and moments of healing. If this heartwarming story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales that celebrate the powerful relationships we have with our pets. Join us in celebrating the unconditional love that animals bring into our lives. We want to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and share your own stories of connection, growth, and second chances. Every story is worth telling, and we're here to share them with you. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the greatest gifts are the ones we have to rediscover.